Okay, so my name is Josef Patočka. I'm a researcher and campaigner based in Reset, Platform for Socio-Ecological Transformation. And this afternoon I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion with Ji.hlava, who is a sociologist working on things from populism to cryptocurrencies to post-colonialism. He's also researching the current contemporary political processes in our part of the world, meaning on the periphery or semi-periphery of the world system, periphery of the EU. So welcome, Jan.
Thank you.
So in the previous segment, we were discussing the issue of community in the Czech society of today and ways to overcome the individualism of Czech society, whereas in this we will put this in a more international context, and especially context of our region, where after the fall of what was called real existing socialism, so the period of the dictatorship of communist parties, we have seen a period of what has been described as a liberal democracy. There has been a lot of optimism connected with our region being able to adopt Western patterns of democracy and liberalism. This optimistic narrative, as well as a capitalist market economy, and this optimistic narrative has been in recent years kind of endangered by a wave of populist mobilizations around national identity and conservative cultural politics, and it is the question stands of like, where do we go next? Because I think the thesis that Jan will be presenting here is that this wave of national populist mobilizations cannot be seen as some exception or something accidental, but as precisely a logical result of the previous neoliberalization of our societies. So the question will be like, where do we go next? And for this, I will pass the word to Jan to make his introductory presentation or statement, and after that we will have the opportunity to discuss this in more depth.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here. It's really great. I thank the organizers for putting all this together. I have written it down for the sake of timekeeping. I have some presentations, so you don't need to stare all the time at me. I don't think it's so interesting. And later we're gonna have a discussion. I hope you're gonna join. Okay, so yeah, I think we may start. Those of us who are old enough to have it doesn't work. Hang on. Oh, no, it stopped working. We tested it before. Now it works. Okay. Those of us who are old enough to have lived through it remember that sentiment quite well. There was widespread euphoria following the fall of the Soviet bloc in the early 1990s. Despite the hardship and uncertainty it brought, there was also widely felt hope and joy at the systemic change that had seemed close to impossible even several years earlier. That feeling was shared between the East and the West. American philosopher Francis Fukuyama judged that event so important that he even claimed we had lived through the end of history. Fukuyama believed the so-called communist bloc presented the last and only practically existing alternative to the liberal order, that is, to the combination of the free market, individual freedoms, and parliamentary representation. Thus, he regarded the fall of the Soviet Union and its entire bloc as an empirical proof of the ultimate value and strength of liberalism, which seemed to him to have no real alternatives. He prophesied the future would follow one inevitable path of the worldwide spread of the liberal order. Today, it seems naive to believe that, as we have seen at least two widespread and systemic alternatives to liberalism that have gained traction in various parts of the world in the last 2 decades: religious fundamentalism and conservative right-wing populism. Even Fukuyama realized his mistake to a certain extent and backtracked on his original thesis. However, at the time, in the early 1990s, most commentators, especially in the mainstream public debate, seemed to have agreed with him. Not all did. And there were also different voices painting a less optimistic and more somber picture. One of them was the prominent French philosopher Alain Badiou. In 1991, he published a short book called The Désastre Obscur, devoted to the collapse of so-called communism in the Soviet bloc. In his eyes, quote, "The political crisis that this collapse bears witness to is a crisis in the West just as much as it is in the East," unquote. According to Badiou, the triumph of capitalism should not be interpreted as a victory of freedom and emancipation. On the contrary, here I quote more extensively from his book. "It is precisely here where the obscurity and the difficulty of the moment resides. The fact that the Stalinist mode of politics was saturated and moribund. These are all excellent things. But instead of opening the path to an eventuality from which the deployment of another mode of politics would proceed, another singular figure of emancipation, this collapse occurs under the aegis of the democracy of imperial owners. That the supreme political advisor of the situation is Bush, that the desire flaunted is that of inequality and ownership, that the measure of all things is the IMF, that thought is only the vain reassessment of the most basic and most convenient opinions. If this were really to be the course of things, what a melancholy." That's the end of the quote. So it's clear that Badiou's melancholy did not originate from any sort of nostalgia for the past or admiration for the Soviet Union. It was rather his critical view of the present and the future that made him skeptical to the alleged triumph of freedom and progress in the early 1990s. Looking from today's perspective, we can better see not only the pertinence of Badiou's position, but also the more detailed social and political landscape shaped by the obscure disaster he discussed 30 years ago. Interestingly enough, it was not a random contingent catastrophe, but, as Badiou claimed, one intimately linked with the mode of transformation undertaken after 1989 in the former Soviet bloc. Inequality and privatization mentioned by Badiou were accompanied in the early 1990s by a less visible yet immensely impactful process, the destruction of the commons. A short comment on this picture. I started this year using AI to generate some images if I couldn't find a proper image. I used mostly Stable Diffusion before, and now I decided to use, as DALL-E got integrated with ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion gives you more control over the picture because you can control the prompt. However, ChatGPT linked to Stable Diffusion is super interesting because you can see how a machine visualizes an abstract idea. So what I do is just I paste in a part of my text, and I take the images that are generated. So that's how AI is imagining the destruction of the commons. That devastation occurred simultaneously at both the material and symbolic levels. The material aspect took the form of parallel dismantling of public property through privatization and the erosion of the welfare state via austerity politics. This occurred at varying paces throughout the bloc, with Poland being one of the most radical examples, while Czechoslovakia, splitting in two separate states in 1993, adopted a somehow more conservative approach. However, the general direction and nature of the process were consistent across the entire post-Soviet bloc. The devastation of the symbolic commons occurred through the erosion of two patterns of collective identification that played a progressive role in history for almost the past 2 centuries, those of class and trade union. In fact, in our part of the world, it was the combination of the parallel destruction of the material and symbolic commons that yielded the bitter fruit of populist reaction. I will return to this point later on, but first, let me reflect for a moment on the role and significance of the common in the human world. Deeply interpolated by liberal ideology, this is also AI. Deeply interpolated by liberal ideology, we tend to view our everyday functioning through the lens of individual subjectivity, which distorts the actual state of affairs. Life, every life, whether human or any other animal species, is deeply rooted in the material commons. An obvious and fundamental example is our collective dependence on natural commons: air, water, soil, climate, and the pool of genes we share not only among us, humans, but also with essentially all living matter. According to the evolutionary concept of universal common ancestry, also known as common descent, all living organisms on Earth share a common origin, meaning they have all developed from a single pool of ancestral life forms. This suggests that at a genetic level, there is a degree of shared ancestry among all living beings. In the age of pervasive climate crisis, the importance of natural commons needs little elaboration, I believe. Obviously, there is a problem that Gareth Hardin described as the tragedy of the commons, when individual greed leads to destruction of the common resources. Economist Elinor Ostrom proposed several solutions to this dilemma. They all boil down to some form of collective management of the commons. Privatization of these resources leads to a fundamental breakdown and wreaks havoc on communities that permit it. Nature is just the paradigmatic example, but it's not the only aspect of the material commons we depend on. In modern societies, these commons are found all around us. Public infrastructure, public services, and public institutions all play a vital role in our lives. The example of the United States attests to the importance of the material commons and the perils resulting from a lack thereof. Despite being the richest country in the world, the US lags behind in providing fundamental services to its population, such as reliable transport infrastructure, drinking water, healthcare, or security, largely due to its reliance on predominantly private solutions. Yeah, you would think that these pictures are from refugee camps, you know, some war-torn, poor area of the world. These are the streets of the richest country in the world, precisely the country that puts all its emphasis on the private and ignores the common. That's what it looks like. Now, the other kind of commons, the symbolic one, is more elusive to grasp, yet equally important and impactful. Our cognitive access to the symbolic sphere is possible only through abstract concepts, as opposed to the concrete experience of the material. However, the symbolic commons play an equally constitutive role in our world. Two paradigmatic examples are language and scientific knowledge. Both depend on our collective actions and function best when operating in the mode of the common. Any privatization would dramatically hinder them. Imagine if words had a TM sign attached, and you could only use them if you paid a fee to their owners. Consider, for instance, if a term like deconstruction wasn't coined by disinterested philosophers like Jacques Derrida and Paul de Man for the sake of advancing common knowledge, but by profit-driven corporations that would confine them within intellectual property laws. Such a move would render them simply inoperative. Imagine the inventors of linear perspective charged everyone who wanted to use it in painting. Many masterpieces would never have been created. Or envision Newton demanding a fee from anyone who used or adapted his formulas. Einstein's theory of relativity would have been considered an illegal derivative work, since it directly uses these formulas. You can see it here on the picture. This is the Newton formula for adding velocities, and this is Einstein's, right? So right here you have the entire Newton formula plus the Lorentz transformative added, right? So this is a derivative work in the understanding of copyrights. If this was copyrighted, then this would be illegal without the permission of Newton, and you have to pay for it. This is utterly absurd, right? When you think about it. Einstein himself might be persecuted by a capitalist equivalent of the Holy Inquisition, and his work would be condemned as a violation of property rights. Yeah, you're laughing, but this is the way it works in other areas, including cinema and visual arts, right? However, the aspect of the symbolic commons that is most politically operative is that of collective identification. Contrary to the basic assumptions of liberalism, we cannot sensibly conceive of a human subject as fundamentally singular being, determined primarily by its detachment from other humans. We become subjects because we participate in the common sphere of symbolic exchange that we term culture. A subject is born through socialization within a community. Firstly, through primary socialization within our closest family, and secondly, within peer groups. The subject cannot be described as logically or historically prior to socialization. There is no individual subject that exists before socialization occurs. Rather, the subject is a product of socialization, a debt we owe to the symbolic order and a result thereof. For this reason, we cannot function without a foundational reference to the realm of common symbolic identification. This realm is not only responsible for defining who we are, but more crucially, for the very fact that we exist at all as subject. Collective symbolic identifications have played a pivotal role in shaping the modern world, as it stems from struggles conducted within the realm of these identifications. Social movements crucial for the evolution of modern societies towards an inclusive community of equal citizens, namely the labor and feminist movements, operated through collective identification. The shared experience of a worker in a capitalist system, a woman in a patriarchal society, or a disenfranchised proletarian in a bourgeois political system. The global rise of neoliberalism in the early 1990s both conceptually disrupted and practically dismantled these identities. The term class vanished from social sciences and public discourse during the 1990s. Trade unions, which provided a communal platform for workers' advocacy, were aggressively targeted and weakened. As a side note, in the Polish context, this was particularly ironic and even sadistic, given that a trade union, Solidarność, was heralded by many liberals as instrumental in the downfall of the Soviet bloc during the 1980s. In the most extreme form of neoliberal ideology, even the term society, which signifies our ultimate collective existence, was dismissed. As Margaret Thatcher, this should not be glued together. But well, maybe it's a sign. The real is talking to us. Yes, thank you, Margaret Thatcher. Thank you. As Margaret Thatcher famously stated, there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and their families. It's intriguing to note family as the sole vestige of community in Thatcher's discourse. Neoliberals seemed to believe that once collective identifications of class and trade unions were dismantled, people would be left as isolated individuals, mere elementary particles colliding haphazardly in the chaotic realm of the market. This assumption proved erroneous. Humans inherently seek collective identifications, especially during turbulent times, as the 1990s and 2000s undoubtedly were. Herein lies the aftermath of the simultaneous erosion of both the material commons and welfare system and the symbolic commons of progressive collective identifications, leading to what Badiou termed the obscure disaster. The economic transformation of the Soviet bloc came with immense social cost: poverty, unemployment, and a soaring rise in inequality. In such distressing periods, individuals yearn for communal support, offering a semblance of security and dignity. With the solidarity of class and trade unions eradicated, they naturally gravitated towards whatever remnants of community were available. Regrettably, only 3 forms of communal identification weathered the neoliberal onslaught in the early 1990s: family, nation, and religion. These became the pillars to which the disposed clung, fueling the rise of religious fundamentalism, nationalistic xenophobia, and chauvinistic familism. These ideologies coalesced under the banner of conservative right-wing populism. Hence, contemporary populism isn't merely an arbitrary search of irrationality. It's a direct consequence of the liberal and neoliberal dominance of the 1990s and early 2000s. What insights can we gain from this retrospective analysis? It has been aptly noted that to eliminate something in the social sphere, one must replace it. This is precisely what the liberal genealogy of populism demonstrates. The neoliberalism of the 1990s dismantled the collective identification of class and trade unions. As it turns out, society, much like nature, abhors a vacuum. Liberalism, with its inherently individualistic framework, struggled to offer a substitute for this collective identification. The concept of civil society might be the closest candidate, something from the realm of liberalism that could offer a sphere of collective identification. However, objections raised by Marx in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right remain relevant today. The notion of civil society overlooks the unequal distribution of various forms of capital, to borrow from the terminology of contemporary sociology and Pierre Bourdieu's concepts. Participation in civil society requires several resources. You need symbolic capital, the knowledge necessary to understand civic complexities and engage in public discourse. You also need material resources to sustain a civil society organization, a reality familiar to anyone involved in the NGO sector. Perhaps, most crucially, participation demands time. Ancient democratic philosophers recognized this. They contended that slaves preoccupied with labor lacked the leisure to educate themselves and thus couldn't partake in governance. Only those privileged with leisure can accumulate knowledge and understand the intricacies of social fabric. While this view is definitely cynical, it also holds weight. Given the modern capitalist societies are characterized by inequitable distribution of all these forms of capital, the supposed equality of civil society is largely theoretical. In practice, it becomes an exclusionary mechanism. Those of you who saw the great documentary on the life of Edouard Louis that was presented, I think, yesterday, maybe there's going to be another screening, this really shows to what extent the mainstream of the public sphere is dictated by the rules of bourgeois middle-class habitus, right? What Bourdieu calls habitus. So our way of acting, thinking, but also it's very embodied. The way we smile, the way we move, the way we dress. All this, if you lack resources to at least simulate this kind of habitus, then the public sphere is not for you. To counteract the reactionary collective mobilizations around religion, family, and nation, prevalent under the guise of populism, we require not liberal individualism celebrated as humanity's ultimate destiny in the early 1990s, but instead progressive modes of collective identification. This should effectively address both material and symbolic needs, much like the way populism has successfully done in Central Europe. Using the framework of Nancy Fraser's political philosophy, an impactful political project shouldn't begin with a dichotomy of redistribution or recognition, but should integrate both elements for a comprehensive political blueprint. The community becomes indispensable as it offers pride and dignity, meeting the demand for recognition. As Hegel accurately pointed out, recognition isn't an isolated state, but a communicative relationship. In this context, Central Europe has transitioned from Soviet communism through the phase of liberal humiliation to a populist sense of community. A mere reversion of liberal ideas, a mere reversion to liberal ideas risks provoking an even stronger populist backlash in the future. This risk is evident with the current resurgence of liberal governance in places like Poland. Escaping this cyclical trap without reverting to the shortcomings of the Soviet policies necessitates a move through the commons towards a novel regime. In the absence of a more fitting descriptor, we might tentatively term it communism. Thank you. You know, as Zizek once said, if you're like in front of the people, people are applauding, you can do like Stalin or like Hitler. Because Stalin was there applauding with people, and Hitler was just in front of the people, letting people applaud him. So having this choice between Stalin and Hitler, it's better to be like Stalin than Hitler. That's what Zizek believes, at least, and I find it to be true if we have this horrible dilemma.
It seems I'm Hitler. To begin
maybe there's a third way. I mean, I don't know.
Hopefully. And that's basically my first question.
Yeah.
And so the progression is obvious, like communism enforced an unfree form of community, which was perceived as constraining. Then liberalism promised freedom on the basis of disembedding people from all relationships, basically, except for family. And now this has opened the space, the vacuum, to this return of regressive and potentially authoritarian forms of community, like nation and religious fundamentalism and so on. And so it's clear that we need some kind of alternative based on, and as you mentioned, solidarity, the trade union movement in Poland, they had a very beautiful slogan that sums it up. There is no freedom without solidarity. Nie ma wolności bez solidarności. So, but last year when we were discussing degrowth here in this context, obviously one of the first questions from the audience was some person standing up and saying, now, like, wait a minute, be clear with us. So, are you communists or not? Or like, is this socialism or is so? To get this out of the way, basically, what would you like? What in your idea would be the outlines of this communist regime or mode of this alternative, and how would it be different from what we already had here, as the right wing likes to say, to any redistributive measure, basically?
Right. Now, after you said that, I regret comparing myself to Stalin, because it really looks like a coherent picture of this kind of a nostalgic communist. I think this is a very important issue to discuss, especially in the context of Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called communist or Soviet period. Briefly, I believe that this experiment can be seen as having some sense as a peripheral developmental project of modernization. And in this respect, at least in Poland, I don't know so well the social and economic history of the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia, but in Poland you can clearly see, at least first 20 years after the war, that was a period of significant social development, both material and symbolic. Development of infrastructure, schooling, urbanization, of course the industry, but also the position of women, equality. In this respect, for example, the passage from the Soviet period to the Third Republic, Free Poland, for women, it meant a regression. Right, because access to abortion was much easier during the so-called communist times, right? So in various aspects, it really, in the first 2 decades. Later on, obviously, in the 1980s, it started crumbling down, and the 1980s was a very gloomy decade. And I'm saying this not to defend this project as such, because it would be cynical to say, you know, we had to pay a price for this, and the price was freedom. Obviously, there was a possibility of modernization without this kind of political violence, especially in the Stalinist times. So it's not a justification, it's an attempt to describe this experiment for what it was. It was, again, a peripheral attempt at modernization and development. And again, in this respect, it had some sense. If you look at this as communism from the perspective of like, I don't want to get too academic and theoretical here, but as you read through Marx and you think about what was realized, it would be very difficult to find even a single element of the Marx vision of communism that was realized in the Soviet bloc, and on the contrary, any of the crucial elements of the Soviet bloc that were envisaged by Marx as belonging to communism, right? Marx believed that communism would mean the end of necessity to labor, right? Obviously, it didn't happen. The contrary happened. It was a fetishization of labor. It was a kind of a forced employment. You had to work. And the very identity of laborer became a kind of fetish, which is absolutely contradictory to what Marx believed, because Marx believed that proletariat is revolutionary, because proletariat does not want to transform everyone into proletarians, like other revolutions that try to shape the world according to their identity. But the communist revolution is supposed to abandon the very position of being waged laborer, so there will be no more proletariat, right? This didn't happen. Marx never talked about the dictatorship of centralized party, secret police, censorship, all that. You cannot really find this. Actually, this is a separate discussion, but just to also underline this, that was much more Lenin's invention than Marx. So as a matter of fact, it was not a Marxist state, it was a Leninist state. And Leninist experiment didn't make sense from the point of view of Marxism for various reasons. Marx didn't want the revolution to happen in Russia. There's only one document. It's a letter from Russian communist Vera Zasulich from 1884 or something like this to Marx, where she asks Marx, do you think that the rural community of Eastern Europe, especially Russia, what is called Mir in Russian, do you think that this community provides a kind of blueprint for future communism, right? Marx was very uneasy about it. Also, the first translation of Capital was into Russian, done by Bakunin. Marx dreamed about English translation, it didn't happen. So, having faced this kind of readership and questions coming from Russia, he sort of hesitates in this reply, saying, yes, maybe it would work, maybe not. But in general, the idea of revolution in Russia, it doesn't make sense within Marxism. And so on and so on. This is a huge topic, but my point is that this experiment, it doesn't really make sense to call it communism or communist. It was Leninist in the past. Now the question is what communism would look like, right? And for the time being, it's still a kind of a utopic project, utopistic, right? It's a utopia. It has never been realized. Basically, communism, what communism would have to mean. It would have to mean, this is absolutely crucial, liberation from the obligation to labor. Doesn't mean that we would not be doing anything. It just means that waged labor is absolutely incompatible with communism. And for Marx, this is crucial. And on the political level, it would have to be democratic. Marx really underlined this point on many occasions. In the Communist Manifesto, there is a section that somehow, you could say, describes what happened during the Russian Revolution. But after the experience of the Paris Commune, Marx wrote in the preface to the second German edition of the Communist Manifesto, this idea was bad. It cannot happen like this. We cannot just take the state power and use it for our own purposes. So you may say that even within his lifetime, Marx understood that this mode of revolution that was enacted later would not work, that it has to be more democratic, more inclusionary or participatory, as we would say today. Now, I use this word communism. That is not my invention. You may Google it. There are books and articles and discussion forums about it. To underline, precisely because communism, it refers us to community. I think community is needed, and it's inevitable. We, as I said, we are only subjects, humans, and we can fully exist and develop within a community. However, I think it sort of like drags us towards the particular, while communism underlies the commons, and the commons are universal in terms of belonging to everyone and being universally accessible and being shared on like the highest level, right? We all on planet Earth, we all depend on the natural commons equally, right? This right-wing idea that you can hide in a sort of bunker and be safe from the global climate change, etc. This is a fantasy. It's not going to work. We are all going to suffer. Some places more, other places less. But for example, the phenomena like climate migrations, for example, they are also going to reach even this global north that believes itself to be somehow secured against the direct consequences of the climate change. So the commons, I would say that communism is more attractive precisely because of this material, universal message that it conveys. It's not about community, because community, a family is community, a church is a community, a nation is a community. And we have seen it used in a very regressive way, right? The commons are universal. They need to be like universally accessible, both material and symbolic. So I believe it's better. And also, maybe, well, here it's not the case, but I've always thought that maybe it allows us to avoid the discussion about communism, which is important. However, also it's a question of historical discussion. It's very interesting and very important. However, if we are about to construct some new project, it's better to talk about its merits and not so much about what was the value of the experiment that Lenin started during the revolution.
Like, for me, that brings me very well to some of the other things I wanted to ask you, and one of those is precisely like what would you see as the forms of practice of already existing forms of sociability or institutions that could serve as like seeds of communism in the Central European context, because as we have been discussing here in the previous debate, it is often the case that there is quite a lot of community actually amongst people on a very grassroots level. So, for example, people in gardening colonies, they share tools, they share what they grow, or we still have, despite all the attempts to destroy them or also symbolically marginalize them, we still have both cooperatives and trade unions in our space as these forms of basically like democratic community. But people are very hesitant to call these things communities, or to institutionalize them, or to name them as some organized collectivity, because there is this trauma of the imposed top-down organization. So even maybe looking on the ground in your own country, Poland, and your experience from the region, where do you see the kinds of bottom-up movements that are already the sprouts of communism in our or a more solidaristic communitarian society?
Yeah. I think there is a kind of change happening in relationship towards certain terms and certain kind of language that for older generations is associated, when you say like alienation or exploitation, is associated with this official jargon of the state propaganda, and it's for this reason is difficult to tolerate. My experience with my students who are born like 2002 or 2003 is that for them it's just a language. Like you have liberal language, you have conservative language, you also have anti-globalist kind of communist language. So it's I think this is changing. So maybe with time we can overcome this kind of negative reaction. Now, where do we see a kind of elements or like some things happening that you can say this is already like showing us where to go? David Graeber, the great and unfortunately late American anthropologist, he had this idea of everyday communism. He said, when you take a look at how society functions day to day, like what our life looks like, this is basically much more communist than this is private liberal, right? You're at the table, even in a restaurant, like, and there is a salt on another table, and then you say to somebody, could you please pass me the salt? This person does not make a calculation how much energy I'm going to use passing you salt and then calculating what is the cost of 1 calorie and how much do I have to ask from this person to do it. There is a kind of a natural disposition of just doing this for the others, right? And of course, we do it in small things because they do not require effort. We are unwilling to do that if we have to sacrifice something and we have a feeling that we lose something or we are exploited. But this, I think, points us to the a kind of very basic material problem. Misery and poverty is always going to push us towards this kind of a protective, hostile community. So this is why I think redistribution has got this when you take a look at the history of populism, not only in Central Eastern Europe, you can clearly see that populism has become very popular in the places that had experience with harsh neoliberal transformation or very harsh experience with like colonial exploitation, etc., etc. So just as lack of redistribution pushes people to this kind of a protective community, I believe redistribution, when people are not afraid that they would perish, that they lose something, they are much more willing to share and participate in this kind of common enterprises. They become more communist than individualist. The same, there's a research showing that as people get elevated from extreme poverty, they tend to pay more attention to environmental issues, right? Once they say, okay, I do not only focus on my individual income and if I'm going to pay my bills, I can think about something else, right? It's also a little bit like this pyramid of needs that we know from Maslow, right? Once our basic needs are satisfied, we can go higher towards like a more abstract and more open relation towards the world. So I would say that this, and I think this is, and also the language that I mentioned. I think language is a very interesting example because language is absolutely communist. Language is the common, language is collectively managed in a kind of a day-to-day use, a democratic use. You have these bodies or these authorities that try to prevent us from using certain words, right? Like in Poland, there has been an ongoing stupid discussion around the feminative forms of words, right? I don't know how Czech, in English it doesn't make sense, but in Polish you have different words to say, for example, professions or certain adjectives, right? When you say for a man and for a woman, and Polish language loves all kind of word creation. So I think it functions quite well in the Polish language. But obviously there are some stupid people who say you cannot do that because we have not done it in the past. And nobody can stop it. If we, as users of language, if we start using these words, this is called usus in language theory, they will become words, right? This is a kind of a democratic, horizontal process. So I think I'm telling this, I know it may seem not tangible, like not like a concrete, initiatives like this institution or that. I'm telling this to underline this kind of fundamental communist dimension of our functioning. Now, when you think about more concrete examples, obviously there are, this is an interesting question, do we need tradition for everything to be inspired, right? 10 or 15 years ago, there was a discussion in Polish parliament about the law that would allow people to vote through internet. Right? You don't have to go to the polling station, just like you do with your online banking, right? Then after this discussion, a prominent right-wing politician who is already dead, I'm not going to tell you who, just an anonymous anecdote, he was stopped by a journalist in the parliament and was asked, what do you think about the idea of voting through internet? And then he said automatically, I'm against. In Poland, we have no tradition of voting through internet. Yeah, obviously, we don't have, but that's that's the thing. We do not need to have tradition for everything to invent new solutions, right? We orient ourselves towards the needs and opportunities that we have, and then we invent something. So I don't think we necessarily always need a tradition to refer to. However, if you want to look for such traditions, I think our part, I don't know what is your experience as, in the Slavic camp, we say that like Czech people are, maybe you are Slavic or maybe you are already like Germans, right? Somewhere like in between. We don't really know, but in the Slavic camp, I think there is a strong tradition or history on insistence on self-governance and cooperation. You have the great cooperative tradition. Edward Abramowski, one of the most important theorists of the cooperative movement. He was a Polish thinker and activist. But also, if you go further east, Ukraine, right? Makhno Republic. Between the war the period. This idea of self-governance and self-organization. Basically, I think this is why anarchism gets so much traction in Eastern and Central Europe, because this is this kind of idea of horizontal organization, right? But I don't think we necessarily need to look, even if maybe in some cases tradition is important, but we do not necessarily need to look at our particular tradition and particular places. Today, I participated on the audience in a really great panel that was dedicated to citizen assemblies, right? A kind of thing that already is being practiced. It's not just a utopia. You can point to important examples, for example, Ireland, right? The place where homosexual marriages and, well, let's call it like this, and abortion, two very important reforms, went through these citizen assemblies, right? Which are basically, they are very interesting because they really offer an alternative to liberal politics, right? Because the mode of constitution of citizen assembly is not by voting and representation like the parliament, it's by a random selection from the population. So you can say that this group is representative, like in social research. When you have a research group, you have to randomization, we know it's like a basic methodological argument that randomization is the best way to construct a representative group, right? In liberal mode, you do not have randomization, you have elections. You vote for a certain representative, and this representative can basically do whatever they want. They are not, it's called a free mandate, as imperative mandate. Imperative mandate means you send someone and you oblige this person to take certain decisions, right? So if during the election campaigns this person said, I will always vote for bike lanes and not for new parking places, and then this person votes the contrary, you have the right to recall your support, right? So this is, citizen assembly is interesting because it's not precisely, it's not a civil society mode of functioning. It's a kind of a new, I think it explores political power as the common. This is also, I think, a very important kind of the common, is political power, because political power in a democratic society is our common will. It's also a kind of a common resource, right? This is our common ability to act and to do something, right? Then you have cooperatives, obviously. The problem with cooperatives is that they get very easily integrated into a capitalist landscape, and then they have to start functioning like capitalist enterprises, right? But 20 years ago in Argentine that now is going through this really horrible process of presidential elections. Maybe you know that the candidate who is likely still to win is in favor not only of free access to guns, but also free organ trade. Right, so it's really incredible. But Walter Benjamin had this great observation. He said every wave of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution. There was a failed revolution in Argentina 20 years ago, and that was the movement to occupy factories. Naomi Klein did a great documentary on this. It's called The Take. I don't know if you can see it online. For sure, you can download it illegally through torrent. This is what I did. And it documents, there was like several hundred cases of workers overtaking closed factories. Because after 2001 financial crisis in Argentina, a lot of capitalists decided this is not good time to produce. Now I'm going to go to Miami and spend half a year on the beach. When it settles down, I will come back and reopen the factory. For the workers, the workers didn't have this kind of luxury. They had to work and produce to earn money. So they were breaking into factories and reopening them under their collective management and ownership. And this documentary really portrays this phenomena in a great way, and you can see how well it functioned, how well it produced, and also how much it empowered the workers. There's a lady who is telling about her experience, and she says, before, when I was just employed in this factory, I was coming back home, I was tired, I was also frustrated and depressed. The only thing that I could do was to watch stupid soap operas on TV. Now, I feel that something depends on me, that I have a say in what is happening in the factory. I come back home, I read Marx, I want to educate myself, I want to understand the world better, right? So you can see, this is another example, and it functioned very well. This factor is actually, it's very well shown how well they produced and how efficient they were. They were closed down by force when the owners came back from their holidays in Miami, and through court orders and through forcefully they got these factories back, right? So there's. Yeah, I'm just, I think this is an important example because it refers to the sphere of political economy. The problem I have with citizen assemblies, and something that also came up today as a question from the audience, is what about capitalism, right? Because you asked this question. Yeah, it was really a great question, because you have a citizen assembly, but it functions within a capitalist society where ownership is beyond political decision, right? So without addressing the question of political economy, which is ownership of the workplace, we are not really going to move past capitalism. There are some good things we can do. It's not that it's, 0, 1, all or nothing. However, we need to also address this question of political economy. So I believe to end this, I know too long answer, but this is a huge question. So with the advancement of AI, suddenly, in a very bizarre way, discussion around universal basic income reappeared, right? This is a very old idea. Actually, it shows, I also saw a great documentary, I don't remember the author, I'm sorry, precisely about this idea of universal basic income. That was already considered as possible to be introduced in 1970s. Then with the advent of neoliberalism, it became something like a complete heresy. What do you mean you don't work and you receive money? It doesn't make sense, right? It sort of reappeared maybe a decade or a decade and a half ago, and there has been experiments also showing that it works quite well. This is not true that people who receive this basic income would just sit in front of a TV and drink beer and be lazy. It's very interesting, somebody observed that it's always a kind of fantasy about other people. So people say, if we have basic income, people would sit in front of a TV, drink beer. Then you ask them, are you going to do this? They always say, me, no. Somebody else, right, is going to do this. And this is not actually happening in real life. And it reemerged with AI, because something that actually, again, if we go back to communism, Marx actually put this picture in very, very few details, like what it's going to look like. But in Grundrisse, which is the outline of the critique of political economy, he sort of like projects this picture of the future, and it looks like Trekonomics, like Star Trek economy, the science fiction TV series, which means machines work, machines produce, machines are socially owned and socially controlled, and the product of these machines is distributed within population according to people's needs to kind of satisfy these basic needs, right? So AI is kind of taking us there. And in this text, Marx it's very interesting, because he talks about the autonomous system of machines. Not about machine, not about system of machines, but something that he precisely calls autonomous system of machines, where machines produce, and people are just appendixes to the machines, which means they just control a small parts of this process. So AI is kind of taking us there, and the discussion about around universal basic income, I think it makes sense in this context. That, like, you know, if our workplace is going to be taken by machines, then we need something else to be able to live, right?
We would still probably need to solve the challenge of how to fuel all those machines without fossil fuels, but...
Yeah, of course. There are limits. There are obvious environmental limits, yeah.
I would have many more questions, but I think it's the right time to open the floor to questions from the audience. When you raise your hand, I will give you the floor, but please wait before you are given the microphone. Anyone wants to ask a question? Here's a raised hand.
So if I understand correctly, you basically propose a revolution. And I would like to ask, who is going to do it? Is it because you earlier mentioned the film Edouard Louis, and we have different classes, so who is going to be the revolutionary class?
That's a good question. It is a revolution in terms of radicality of the goal that is to be attained. However, I don't think that necessarily the transition to this goal needs to be revolutionary in the way we understand this term, as a kind of punctual, violent event that marks the end of the old and the beginning of the new, right? Because if you look historically, then passage from one form of production to another not necessarily happened through this kind of revolution, right? You may say passage from feudalism to capitalism proceeded through industrial revolution. That was not revolution in this understanding, right? It was not a kind of, 2 months where capitalists destroyed feudalism and they built factories everywhere, right? We say industrial revolution, but it's a term that describes a process that was taking around 100 years, or maybe even is still going on. We don't know, right? There were several, they say, like a first stage, second stage. Now it's another revolution with IT, etc., etc. There was a political revolution, the French Revolution, but it was not this kind of singular, violent event. When you go back, the transition from slavery to feudalism, there was no revolution at all. It happened throughout several centuries in a kind of a more gradual process, right? So, I don't have answer to this question, how it's going to happen, because I think future, Hegel has got this figure of, you can only understand what has happened, right? We don't have really cognitive access to the future. So I don't know how and if it's going to happen. There surely needs to be a subject, organized subject, that would be acting to introduce these changes. However, sometimes I think this introduction may be paradoxical and not direct. For example, when you look, there is a great text written by Antonio Negri, where he goes back to John Maynard Keynes, right, the iconic liberal economist, and he found some obscure writings and correspondence by Keynes, where actually it turns out that Keynes was following very closely the Russian Revolution. He was reading Lenin and following what was happening in Russia. And then he says, now we have a choice. Either we reform capitalism to make it more equal, more redistributive, and less oppressive for the working class, or we're going to have another Russian revolution everywhere. So you may say that although this revolution failed in its attempt to introduce communism, although it was confined to a certain geographical area, right? They tried to carry revolution to Germany, 1920, 1921. They failed, also because of Poles. That's a kind of a reactionary role that we Poles played in the history, that we stopped the attempt to help the German Revolution, where Rosa Luxemburg was killed. So it remained confined to Russia. However, it had an influence on the general trajectory of capitalism. You may risk a thesis. Of course, the counterfactual analysis in history is always risky, but without a pressure, this is not my observation. This is Immanuel Wallerstein, an American sociologist. He said that the pressure that there is a risk of a widespread workers' revolt was an important force behind establishment of welfare state. And once this pressure disappeared, after the failure of the revolutions or attempted revolution of 1960s, capitalists felt now we can do whatever we want, and you have neoliberalism with its reaction. You look at the United States, at the earnings, the wages, between 1950 and 1975, there is a constant growth of wages of workers. Then from 75 to 1990s, there's a constant decline. In 1995, the bottom 20% of US workers earns exactly the same as they did in 1955. All this progress that was thanks to a collective mobilization was lost, right? So I think that, again, what I said at the beginning, if you think about the radicality of a change that we need, it is a revolution. Does it necessarily need to be enacted in this kind of a violent singular event? I don't think so. But for sure, there needs to be subject that is going to exercise some pressure, and it needs to be us, because there's no one else in the world, right? There's no UFO and alien force that would arrive. It's only us. We are in a situation of an immanence on the planet Earth, right? So it's us that we do something, or if we don't now with the climate crisis, it's not so much question. I think with climate crisis, it stopped being a moral or ethical question. It's an existential question, right? If we allow capitalism to do what the capitalists want, in another 30 years, there will be no more planet to save, right? Because you can see, like, we are really on the path to a kind of a total climate crisis in the second half of 21st century. Everything shows that, 1.5 degree, forget it. This has already happened, most likely, right? 2 degrees, 2.5 until the end of century. It looks like we're on a path on 3 or 4 degrees change in the average temperature towards the end of history. If we follow this business as usual model, and everything indicates that this is what is happening, right? The famous report on the limits of growth from the 70s, they had 4 scenarios, and a kind of a doomsday scenario was business as usual. And now I think 2 years ago, they did a reassessment, a group of economists, and we are following this business as usual, which is a kind of a linear path towards the destruction, right? So now it stopped being a moral or ethical issue. Somebody's exploited or alienated. Now it's an existential issue. If we don't stop capitalism, capitalism is going to stop life on Earth the way we know it, right?
I think that raises many more questions. Are there any in there? Yeah.
I can hear you more or less. Creative industries in the context of basic income.
Thank you. So, should I repeat the question? Is this too much? Yeah. Okay, so I was wondering, how do we imagine the future of creative industries within the context of a common universal salary of basic needs? I'm not saying correct the terms, but I'm thinking in Greek right now. And the autonomization of the machines. In terms of production, I don't want to drive the conversation into this romantic idea of the artists as manufacturers. I'm just trying to imagine how to ask you more, how would we imagine the creative process within that, and how would we also project this historical fact of the background of the artist, which was more or less very much influenced by the class and the social background. I mean, who is going to be the person who will be bringing the content into art if we're talking about people who will have solved their basic needs somehow? Or will it be like a hobby for them? I mean, I'm just having more ideas.
Yes, thank you. Great question. I think totally that artist is a class description and class situation. I went for the great screening about AI, the first Wednesday, and there was a discussion later on about precisely how AI is going to change creative endeavor, right? And somebody whom I didn't know but described himself as an artist also said that there's a crucial thing of access to the markets, right? So everybody with AI tools, everybody can create. And even formally, you look at it, and it looks like a professional art. However, this person is not in a social circuit that allows them to present it as art and sell it as art, right? So, and here you see that really artist is a name of a certain social position, a class position, right? However, I think creation, it's a completely different thing. And actually, creative process is a great example of the commons in action. This is every creative process is a part of a communal endeavor, right? Because you only create within a pool of a certain existing elements, right? You may do the most original painting. However, you have not invented the idea of doing a painting. You have not invented the idea of doing it this way. You have not invented the idea that you can create something. And in most cases, when you look, this is the idea behind the Creative Commons, right? Which I think it's I like copyleft more, because copyleft is, I think, less susceptible to be used for private purposes, right? Because what is copylefted, like general public license, needs to always stay out of this kind of private sphere. You cannot link it. Like the Creative Commons, some licenses allow you to link the private, which is exclusionary, with the common. But basically, that's the idea behind the whole movement of Creative Commons, right? That you create using the common pool of existing patterns and elements, and for the creation to continue, you should also give back something. Because if you only take and you close it as your private property, then actually this is the kind of problem with language. The language is productive because it's shared. Words need to be used to be words. Once a word stops being used, then it stops being a word. It disappears, right? So I think that actually creative endeavor, I think, would fit quite well into this paradigm. I think this is a kind of an easier sphere to organize according to this regime of the commons, right? Obviously, that's also, if we talk about the vision and utopia that Marx had, this is precisely what he believed would happen if we don't have this obligation to labor to survive, right? There is a great passage in the introduction to the critique of German ideology, when Marx says, in future, when society takes care of the production, so we have the system of production, I have freedom to do whatever I want and become whatever I want. I can do this in the morning, I can fish in the morning and then write in the afternoon and then do whatever I want. This is a kind of freedom. It's very interesting that the vision that Marx had was that a good society is a society where everyone can realize their individual potential. Marx was very, we have this vision of communism as a kind of bottom-down equalization, like we're all going to be gray in the same uniforms, like China. This is absolutely not the vision that Marx had. Marx, in this respect, was very affirmative towards individual expression and the possibility to develop your individual potential. Where he doesn't say that we all need to be same. Precisely, he says that we all have opportunity to do whatever we want, to be creative in this respect. So I don't know if you use the term creative industries as a kind of a synecdoche for creation, or just the fate of creative industries, because I believe honestly that creative industries, the industry element, is the problem here, right? The very term, actually, cultural industries, comes from Adorno, who coined it as a critical term. He said, this is the kind of commodification of everything, that culture becomes an industry. I think it's an extremely ironic twist that we started using it in a kind of a descriptive and affirmative way, that this is part of the economy. So creativity, creation, I think is going to survive. Creative industry as a part of a capitalist industry, that it is, you can see, like, you know, 1990s, Tony Blair, Cool Britannia, this creative industries ideology, Richard Florida, all that now seems kind of historical, but it was important. So I don't know if the industry element will be doing well. The creative element, I think, will be doing very well. Yeah, but profession, you see...
As in the responsibility, sorry, as in a profession, as in terms of the responsibility that you stand up for something as a role for the community, not particularly to produce something, but as well as a professional, a master of something in a way that it can be understood, of course, in a commons discussion, with the responsibility that goes with it to the society, not to bring money at home, necessarily.
Yeah, again, depends how do you understand profession. If you understand profession as proficiency, which are like closely linked, that you are very good at doing something, that obviously there are creative professionals. If you understand profession as like you have other professions like medical profession, etc., then actually it's very interesting that the idea of the avant-garde, the first avant-garde between the wars, that was closely linked as a formation with the kind of this progressive revolutionary idea of you know, changing society from Russian constructivists all the way to French situationists. It was closely linked. It was precisely to abandon the position of a professional artist and art as something different from life. That was like the kind of basic distinction that the avant-garde did not agree with, that you have a sphere of art and you have a sphere of everyday life, right? And they are opposed, because art is sublime, everyday life is kind of degraded, art object is a kind of cult object, everyday objects are, we don't care about them, art is shown in a separate space, the white cube, so the revolt against white cube. So their idea to abandon this distinction between art and everyday life, I think in this perspective, of course, today the condition of this project is very interesting, because everybody would say it failed. However, it's impossible to imagine contemporary art without the avant-garde project, right? If you try to rewind and do art just as it was done before the avant-garde, you have a kind of academic painting, right? Or a pure ornament, design, not in terms of industrial design, but, you know, making nice objects. So I think we'll have to face at a certain point this kind of overcoming of the position of a professional, as you know, as you have other professions. So you have professional artists. Because the reason why avant-garde artists engage in political struggle is because they believe that art, this new art, cannot be itself within the confines of the old society. Right? For the new art, you need new society. Otherwise, it's not going to work, right? And the transformation in art did take place, while the transformation in society did not take place. Basically, the major coordinates, organizational coordinates of society are just the way they were 100 or even 200 years ago, right? So we have 20th or 21st century art in 19th or even 18th century political situation and economic situation, which obviously creates a lot of friction and tension. So I think it needs, at a certain point, if we move towards this project of this communism, I think we also need to redefine this industry and profession condition within art.
There is a question from the Mr. here in the second row.
Tak ještě jednou. Dobrý večer. Já řeknu tři teze, tezi, která má tři části. A myslím si, že dvě jste zmínili a jednu jste ještě opomněli, ale vůbec bych nesouhlasil úplně s něčím, co jste řekl na začátku, a to je v tom, že vlastně nemůžeme formulovat jakoby nějaký tvar nebo plán nebo strukturu budoucnosti. Teď to říkám tak nadneseně. Ale myslím to tak, že když jsme schopni asi udělat raketu a plánovat jí 20 let a jsme schopni udělat novou vakcínu a tak dál a vypěstovat nové organismy, za chvilku budeme umět udělat místo biologického masa, chemické a tak dále. Takže si představit, že společnost se bude sama vyvíjet stále jenom svým vnitřním mechanismem, je naprosto, nechci říct naivní, ale prostě nekoncepční a opravdu smrtelně ohrožující budoucnost této planety. To je jedna věc. Druhá věc, co jste řekli, s tím ano, jsou dva prvky, ale možná jsou tři a možná je víc. Tady někdo by si určitě něco možná ještě vzpomněl, které budou jako měnit tu budoucnost. Jedno je to, o čem pořád se mluví, ta ekologie, ale v té se zapomíná na jeden zdroj energie novej, který je evidentně, je úplně jako na hraně, už byste dávno s ním měli počítat a předpokládat, dívat se aspoň ne na 5 let dopředu, ale na 50, na 100, a to je fúze jaderná. A tam prostě získáváme energii z vody a získáváme ji úplně jakoby ne jiným, ale v zásadě, no určitě procesem, který nemá zbytkový jako život ohrožující jakoby rezidua. Jo? A to je velký, ale je to jenom to nadnesu, jako to je jedna věc. Druhá věc je to, čili ekologie samozřejmě, ale je potřeba uvažovat teda i o nových zdrojích energie. Ta fyzika nestojí, jako nepřešlapuje na místě, jde dopředu. Že ty fyzici nemluví s tou humanitní složkou vědy, je velký problém a opačně je to velký problém. Ale ještě nezapomeňte na o jedné věci, a to je genetika. Je velký problém, že může být revoluce, ale taky může být antirevoluce v uvozovkách v genetice. Představte si, že čínská společnost se genetiky chopí se jí prostě politicky, chopí se jí mocensky a vytvoří opravdu, protože zase jsme u toho kousíček od toho, já to teď nechci rozebírat do detailu, ale můžeme o tom někde si udělat jako seminář. Prostě žijeme před momentem, kdy budeme umět měnit vlastně genetický základy člověka, že je Evropa, Amerika nedělá, ale Číňani možná tímto směrem uvažují. Takže jako, co je ohrožující a může být, je umělá inteligence, to je opravdu roboti a tak dál. Budou nakonec všude a nebudeme potřebovat.
Ještě prosím stručně, ať ještě zbyde čas tady na
já musím za chvilku odejít, takže omlouvám se, jo. Ale ty tři můžete o tom diskutovat ještě do večera nebo nikdy, jak chcete. Ale čili jsou umělá inteligence, podle mě je velmi vážný problém. Ten se může otočit proti člověku velmi dobře. Genetika se může otočit, když bude uchopena mocensky, velmi proti člověku. A za třetí to, co říkáme, ekologie, ale pokud přijde fyzika s novým zdrojem energie, a to je na spadnutí, pokud v Francii sledujete ten pokus, který tam teď vzniká, tak ta termojaderná fúze je jako už předpokládaná v podstatě dnešní době asi 70 let. Takže to jsou, a tyto tři věci nepůsobí odděleně, ty prostě spolu provázeně. Dál můžeme uvažovat o umění a o tom všem sociologici, to je určitě zajímavé.
Děkujeme za komentář.
Já kladu otázky, ne. Tam je otázka v tom, jak to bude fungovat dohromady. Jestli teda může kolega ještě na to reagovat. To je důležitý, nechte ho vteřinečku.
If you wouldn't mind, I would maybe open it also to the final question from the lady in the first row, and you would respond to both?
Let's do it. Let's do it this way. Thank you.
The funny thing is that maybe I want to ask something similar, but I have no idea what the question exactly was. I heard genetics, and actually my question connected a bit. What I wanted to say is that there is such a level of privatization of life at the moment, looking at the smallest scale to the biggest scale. Of course, I'm also thinking of, for instance, DNA and the patents on actual life, and also the very, very big level of privatization of science. And like looking still at, for instance, 70s, when we think about the TM and the privatization of things that were quite unanticipated to privatize. I have to think back of the Onco mouse, TM, for instance, so this famous mouse that was already possible to be purchased with a cancer to the labs to be tested, and it couldn't multiply. So you had a mouse that it was actually banned from multiplication in a natural way. That was, I think, already in the 70s and described by Donna Haraway. Like looking at the scales of struggle and the amount of struggle, for instance, thinking about the seed diversity and indeed the privatization of the DNA code, like when there is so much activism and work to be done at such basic levels of life, and like working with farming and soil, also what Naomi Klein described as disaster capitalism, as for instance, the situations where very often countries from global south, when wanting to receive any kind of gift, any kind of like present support, they, for instance, have to sign these papers that say you will only use these GMO seeds and you will not have yours anymore, and that's a part of this sweet deal, right? Or like Vandana Shiva wrote about that too. My wonder is if we have privatization at this level, from DNA to deep sea mining to Mars, which I know is a very dystopian view, like, do we then do this work that needs to be done in a free time? Because most of the work that needs to be done is not waged work. We are mostly not hired to do these kind of resistance, and I'm wondering, are we now basing ourselves on like this revolution that doesn't happen in office hours because there is so much work, of course, on the legislative level too, but on all these levels to be done. We want to participate, but the question of like time, resources, and burnout is there too.
Clear where you're getting. Yeah, speaking of a lack of time, we have only 5 minutes for an answer to both these connected questions.
Yeah, so very briefly. Actually, the citizen assembly model includes, in some cases, payment for people who participate, right? So this is one solution. Universal basic income. This is also one of the reasons why we need it, is to precisely free some time to allow us to also be citizens. Because the problem of capitalist modernity is that we have no time for this, right? You sleep 8 hours per day, you work 8 hours per day, you commute to work, you commute back, you need to do some basic maintenance of yourself, let's say, like wash, eat, etc., etc. You want to have some social life, and you have what? 15 minutes to be a citizen during 24 hours, right? And this is how capitalist life looks like. You will never have a, fully functioning civil society as the liberals imagine in this model. So obviously we need that, and I think this is one of the arguments for universal basic income, that it would allow us to also engage in this issue that we need to engage, because the alternative is really very very dark. Now, sorry for brevity, but because of lack of time. Now the question of nuclear fusion, the gentleman already left. My expertise, I'm sorry, in nuclear fusion is zero. I know it exists, I know it looks great, I know it kind of almost functions. I know the problem is you have to put more energy that you get from it in most cases, but maybe this is kind of solution for the future. My worry is that every energy is used for something, and actually energy production, we talk a lot about this because also this can be commodified in alternative ways. There is a market for green energy, so we talk a lot about green energy. There is no market for protecting biodiversity or stopping the soil erosion, so there is like little discussion about this, right? It's the green capitalism model that is a kind of how to make money on ecological transition. I'm skeptical. I'm much more on the degrowth side. I think we just need to reduce the amount of stuff we produce. With zero cost green energy, I think we would produce so much that the result would be worse than the status quo, maybe. So I don't know if this is such a great solution. I only said that we don't, at least I don't know what is going to happen. Not that we should not plan or think ahead or imagine. This is something very, very, Yeah, just a few sentences. This is something very, very important. You know, one of the things that Thatcher also said, there is no alternative. What does it mean? It means do not waste your time imagining different world, because it's not possible, right? So why waste your time? This is a kind of a prohibition to imagine that was very important for neoliberalism. We need to imagine. Imagination is the most political out of all our faculties, because imagination allows ourselves to represent something that does not exist, so we can know that we want to go towards it, right? And last thing about technology, all this technology that is on the brink of being born and introduced, this can be very dangerous, but also it can be a blessing for humanity, right? The problem is who and how is going to control it. So it's a classical question of ownership of political economy. I will give you one precise example, not to be very vague. Autonomous car. Autonomous car, obviously, is going to be a system of autonomous cars. We are probably the last people who are allowed to drive. Driving is going to be prohibited very soon because human driver is the biggest problem in the system. If you only have autonomous cars that link in a network, communicate with one another and coordinate, you can eliminate the collisions because every car knows what the other cars would do, right? Then, imagine such a thing on the city level, right? Like a transportation system. Now you have two scenarios. One, it's city-owned, right? Which means it maximizes average travel time, so every person could travel like in least time, and environmental impact. Or it's private, it's owned by Uber or something like this, and then what they will do is they will sell fast lanes, right? So if you pay more, you will travel faster. If you pay less, you will travel slower. And you will travel faster with paying more money, with more environmental cost. Now, from technical point of view, both systems are equally easy or equally difficult to introduce. For technology, it doesn't matter. It's a question of a political decision how this system is going to work. For the public benefit, if it's publicly owned, or for the private benefit with public costs, if it's owned privately. So this is precisely the stake. It's a political decision and a political control, collective, that we need over this technology. And the same thing about all other technologies we can think of, AI, genetics, etc., etc. It's not the technology itself, it's who owns it and for what purpose it's going to be used.
Thank you, Jan, for this
Thanks a lot.
grand
Thank
finale.
you for staying here.
Thank you for all your questions and your attention.